All right, good morning, afternoon, or evening to you wherever you are. I'm Arslan Arif, the founder of Endpoints News, and we've got an exciting topic today: innovation in clinical research, AI-based drug development tools, and the regulatory landscape. We're sponsored by Unlearn AI, and this is the third and final webinar in our series. So today I'm joined by Charles Fisher, the founder and CEO of Unlearn AI, and I've really enjoyed learning from Charles and getting to know him over the course of this webinar series. He's got a PhD in biophysics from Harvard, and prior to founding Unlearn, he worked as a computational biologist at Pfizer and was a machine learning engineer at LeapMotion. He knows his stuff, and he's been real spirited in taking a wide range of questions from our audience, and we're going to get to see much more of that today. We're also joined by Diane Shota. She served over 30 years at Pfizer in various leadership roles, and she's now the CEO of Grayscaling. She's a regulatory strategist who worked on the first approved virtual clinical trial and developed the regulatory plans behind several blockbusters, including Celebrex and Lyrica. Now she's working in the gray space of regulatory science as an independent consultant. And we also have Wade Ackerman. He's a partner in Covington's FDA regulatory group. He's worked on FDA issues from both an executive branch and a legislative perspective. So after 5 years in the FDA's Office of Chief Counsel, he served on Capitol Hill as a senior FDA counsel to Senators Patty Murray and Tom Harkin on the HELP Committee. He's got insights into a range of legal and regulatory topics, and we're excited to have him here today. So, for the format of today's webinar, I'd actually like to start off with a quick review of the first two webinars in this series, which touched on digital twins and new trial designs using digital twins. And then I'll get to a series of questions for our panel. We'll also get to questions from the audience. So please hit that Q&A button at the bottom over there to get those questions in at any time during the presentation, and I will pose them to the panel. But first, Charles, let's get started with you. Can you walk us through what was in the first two presentations?
Of course, yeah. Thank you very much, Arslan. So I'm going to also weave this into today's discussion. So the first two webinars focused on a particular thing that we would call an AI-based drug development tool, which is a digital twin. And a digital twin is sort of at its core a predictive model. It is a computer simulation of a particular patient where we can predict sort of every outcome associated with that patient if they were to receive a placebo in the context of a clinical trial. So, for example, in Alzheimer's disease, we might predict how that patient's cognitive function may change over time. But more than that, how their lab tests, whether or not they would potentially have an adverse event. So really every single characteristic of that patient that you would want to understand in the context of a clinical trial, we can predict the outcome, how that particular characteristic would change over time. And so what can we then do with this particular AI-based drug development tool, these digital twins? And so when we think about a clinical trial, every clinical trial is a comparison of two potential outcomes. So there is the potential outcome of what would happen to a patient if they were to receive a new drug. And there's the potential outcome of what would happen to that patient if they were to receive a placebo. And the difference between those two things averaged across the population is typically what we want to measure. And so we can use a digital twin trained on historical data from previously completed trials, observational studies, or real-world sources to predict a patient's prognosis if they were to receive the placebo and get access to one of those potential outcomes. And then use that information to run clinical trials that are significantly smaller, where we might require between, say 25 to 40% fewer subjects to be enrolled in a clinical trial, while maintaining all of the statistical characteristics that we would want. So we talked a little bit about in the first webinar, talked about what digital twins are, how we create them with artificial intelligence. And then the second one was really focused on clinical trial designs that include digital twins. These could be prospective clinical trial designs where we can design trials with fewer subjects, or ways that we can add digital twins into ongoing clinical trials to increase statistical power or to buffer against, high rates of patient dropout or noncompliance.
All right. One of the biggest questions we kept on getting in the first two webinars are what were the differences between a synthetic controls derived from real world evidence and digital twins? Could you just touch on that real quick?
Yeah, of course. So a synthetic control, or really any kind of external control, be it the synthetic control arm or historical control arm, you are taking a group of patients from some other data source and just acting as if those patients are enrolled in your clinical trial. And what you're concerned about is balancing sort of characteristics of those patients at the beginning. So you want to make sure, that the patients who are receiving your active treatment in your clinical trial, say their age is on average similar to the patients who you're bringing in from your external data source. And so you're focused on kind of balancing those baseline initial characteristics at the population level. And then just adding patients. If you have 100 patients in your trial, 100 patients in your external control arm, you get 200 patients. And a digital twin is very different. It's not a real patient record. It's not an actual patient that's being taken from any external data source. It is a prediction for the prognosis of an individual patient who's enrolled in your clinical trial. So we're not taking data from external sources and putting it into the trial. We're not increasing the number of patients. Instead, we're making predictions about all of the patients who are enrolled in that trial, and then including those predictions in a statistical analysis. And so the differences end up being really important for the statistical properties of those trials. So when you are incorporating external data as a synthetic or historical or other external control group, you can't ensure that you're not going to increase the rate of false positives. So there's a possibility that you are adding bias to your study. But the way that we can incorporate these predictions into clinical trials, these digital twins, you can get a lot of the benefits in terms of reduction in the required number of subjects without adding any bias. And you can prove mathematically that you aren't adding bias in some of these clinical trial designs. So that's a sort of quick compare and contrast. You're balancing baseline data with synthetic controls, and you're predicting outcomes with digital twins.
All right, thank you very much. And lastly, what other AI-based drug development tools are out there? We talk about AI and drug development as this sort of blanket term, but what other tools are out there outside of what you do at Unlearn?
Well, I think that there's going to be lots and lots of AI-based drug development tools coming sort of down the pipe in the next few years. I think one thing that we've sort of all seen in the news probably in just the last couple of days, which is not exactly an AI-based drug development tool, but was DeepMind's sort of complete destruction of everyone else in the protein folding space by winning the Cas competition by significant margin, right? So this is a huge improvement by leveraging these AI-based tools. And that's really an example of the power that these new modern AI-based approaches have. And I think that when you start thinking about that, how can those tools be used in drug development, right? So there are tools like what we're doing where we're predicting patient outcomes to make clinical trials more efficient. There are other kinds of tools just for identifying patients or recruiting patients more effectively into clinical trials. Designing trials by looking at inclusion or exclusion criteria, biomarkers for measuring endpoints, biomarkers that act as companion diagnostics. There are all of these different tools that could be used that are basically leveraging large amounts of data that we have from clinical trials, real-world sources, genetic data, and then using those to make clinical trials either more efficient or more personalized or some other metric for making clinical trials better.
Right. Okay, let's also get our panel involved now. I've got a series of questions over here. Again, today's session is going to be focused on the regulatory aspects over here. And again, I'd like to encourage the audience to get your regulatory questions in using the Q&A panel. But first, let's start with the FDA, of course. And Wade, perhaps this question is for you first. So what groups at the FDA interact with AI in drug development tools? Can you just describe us who the stakeholders are?
Sure. I mean, I know there's going to be folks participating here that know the FDA very well. There's going to be folks participating that, probably don't work with the FDA on a daily basis. So let me just take that question and level set a little bit. The FDA is organized into different product centers that have to do with what their jurisdiction of regulation is. And there is a lot of the talk at FDA around AI historically over the last few years has been with the Device Center, CDRH, which has regulatory authority over medical devices. When we talk about use of AI in clinical trials and drug development, that implicates the drug centers, the Center for Drugs and the Center for Biologics, which are separate centers, and they do coordinate on a host of fronts, including in combination products and in guidance documents and other policies. But they are separate centers, and that does create, I think you talk to anyone at FDA, that itself creates some challenges. And so I know Diane in a moment is going to talk a little bit more about novel clinical trial innovation and design. So, I'll just mention, some of the institutional programs within those different centers. On the device side, recently they created an Office of Digital Health. It's called a Center of Excellence for Digital Health. And it models a center that FDA created across the centers a few years ago for oncology, and the Center of Excellence for Oncology. And this Digital Health Center of Excellence really is housing a lot of expertise within CRH around AI. A few years ago, or 18 months ago or so, they put out a framework for how the center proposes to regulate AI-based and ML-based solutions. They've also put out a host of guidance about how they want to regulate software when it is a medical device beyond just AI. And this new center's intent, as I understand it from talking to folks involved at FDA, has been that they're a resource not only for the Center for Devices, but also other centers as they're dealing with AI-based solutions. Within the Center for Drugs, and again, Diane, I'm not going to steal some of your thunder here with the review divisions. There are a lot of programs that were put in place that I know we'll talk about later, including some I was involved with the 21st Century Cures Act, that is happening on the drug side of FDA, the drugs and biologics side. Ultimately, where the rubber meets the road is with the individual review divisions who receive the applications that they will be reviewing for approval or a complete response letter. And so there are different qualification programs for drug development tools we'll get into in a minute that are center-wide. But ultimately, if you're seeking to use a drug development tool in your development program that will ultimately affect whether that review division decides to approve your application or not, the real rubber on the road is whether that review division thinks that tool has been qualified for the context that you plan to use it in that program. So I'll stop there. I know we're going to dig down deeper on a lot of those fronts, but I wanted to just level set that there's a lot of talk of AI at FDA. It tends to be on the device side where we're talking about drug development. The stakeholders that will have significant impact are the CDER and CBER review divisions.
Okay. Well, can you tell us what actions the FDA has already taken in regard to AI regulation here?
Sure. I mean, I'll dig a little bit deeper in the framework I mentioned, because their FDA didn't put out a guidance. They really put out a framework to get comments on, and there are comments you can go and peruse if you're interested from different industry groups and other stakeholders. FDA on the device side recognized that AI and ML-based solutions have new paradigm implications for FDA, right? It is not something that's fixed in time that they can evaluate at that moment, and then forever that will be the product that is utilized within the marketplace. They recognize that AI ML-based softwares have the ability to evolve over time. And Charles, you're the expert on this. I sort of welcome your thoughts on these as well. But this framework proposed that FDA would essentially review a change control at the time of market entry, and that change control would set parameters under which the solution could evolve on the market. Anything beyond that would come back to FDA. That's a oversimplification what's in the framework, but at core, that's what they're doing. They're sort of putting in place guardrails, which does put a product or a solution on the market. Again, if it's a device, if it's a non-device, they don't have jurisdiction on the device that it is. But if it's a device, that's the framework that they're proposing. We haven't seen any updates since that paper as far as putting in place, for example, good machine learning practices. A lot of folks wonder whether FDA is eventually going to issue a guidance or a regulation similar to what they've historically done for drug and device manufacturing. Are they going to put out good machine learning practices that outline that? I did a panel recently with one of FDA's leads on that, and it does sound like they're deeply thinking about those kinds of issues. But I think FDA is continuing to think about policies internally and put out guidance and other policies while the world around us is quickly innovating. And we'll talk more about that challenge I'm sure later in the panel.
Okay, I appreciate that. So let's talk about actually new trial innovations here. So we learned a little bit about on the AI side, but Diane, how has the FDA approached other types of novel trial innovations?
So the examples that come to mind when I think about innovation are the areas of decentralized trials, real-world evidence, and rare disease. So in decentralized trials, I recently saw a notice by the IEEE, that's an organization that develops standards for a broad range of technologies, and they have a project called Technology and Data Harmonization for Enabling Decentralized Clinical Trials. And what caught my eye is in their little leadership box, they do have an advisor from FDA. And so that is one way that FDA is able to monitor and influence, I think, and learn about some of these new technologies. In the real world evidence arena, we see the framework for real world evidence come out. We've also seen guidances from both the drug and device divisions, as well as demonstration projects where they're learning, and I think we're all learning together about new technologies. In the rare disease area, I was recently reading about the Rare Disease Cure Accelerator. So this is a project where FDA has funded the Critical Path Institute, and they are putting together, they have a platform for data sharing and analysis to accelerate rare disease. They also, FDA recently had, earlier this year had a public meeting called End-to-End Development of Individualized Therapies. Those are the treatment really of N of 1. So very, very innovative. So those are the ways they fund research. FDA participates in these multi-stakeholder organizations and hold public meetings and issue guidances for comment. And those are, I think, some of the approaches that I've seen FDA use.
Okay, well, let's take it to how a company like Unlearn or another company that's developing these AI-based development tools. So how can they interact with these regulatory bodies?
So I would, for technology companies, I would categorize the interactions in kind of two buckets for the US. There's one bucket where you do not have an IND, and those interactions where there is an IND holder. So for no IND, they have programs like the CPIM meeting. It's a critical path innovation meeting. They have a meeting called Fit for Purpose. And if you have an IND, you can participate in certain pilot programs like the Clinical Innovation Design Pilot, or you can get a meeting with FDA on drug-specific advice. We typically call that, a type C. As usual, there are advantages and disadvantages for these types of interactions. When you do not have an IND, the advantage is a company like Unlearn, who does not have any drugs in their portfolio, is they can go and interact with FDA on their own. The disadvantage is there are no set timelines to these, and a lot of times the advice is general. If you go through the IND route, there is the extra complex step of partnering with someone that has an IND. The good news is that they do have set timelines for a lot of these interactions. In Europe, they have a different system, and it's a clearer path for drug development tools. They actually have a specific procedure called qualification of novel methodologies. It's fee-based and with timelines. So those are some of the ways to interact with regulators.
Diane, I might just jump in there too, just to maybe provide some context of why we don't have the third pathway here in the US, because just as some history I can share with folks is that the public qualification program for drug development tools and biomarkers was put in place formally put in place in the statute in the Cures Act, the 21st Century Cures Act that I worked on the Hill in 2015 and 16. I will say, first of all, there was probably no provision of the whole law, with maybe a couple exceptions, that the center director level was extremely involved in providing technical assistance and guidance. And that was really Dr. Woodcock, who was terrific. And that shows, I think, the engagement of FDA leadership around sort of this innovation in the space. It's going back several years ago. In that law, I mean, of course, as Diane mentioned, there's the IND, right? A pharmaceutical company, a biopharma company is coming forward with their IND and eventually their NDA or BLA for approval or licensure. And the challenges there are the company has to sort of be comfortable. When there's a certain method they've used previously, you have to be comfortable with that. And I do think we're seeing more and more innovation there and partnerships with companies like Unlearn and others, because FDA is open to having those conversations. In the Cures Act, we also put in place a formal place for public qualification of biomarkers and drug development tools, right? So that is where you can go to FDA to get a tool qualified, but everything about it is public. The letters are in public. As Diane said, there's no timeline. The reason we didn't put in place at the time what I'll call the third pathway, which would be a proprietary qualification program that's not sort of a consortium qualifying a biomarker or something like that, is resources. Because what we heard loud and clear from FDA at the time was, we have PDUFA resources to review applications and work on INDs and take Type C meetings. We do recognize that this public qualification process has value and that it, once qualified, a tool could be used for multiple sponsors and applications, which is why there are transparency provisions around it. But from a resource perspective, we at the time, at least, and this is several years ago, FDA was concerned, and I think appropriately so, about do they create a third pathway to qualify proprietary tools across the board. I do think we just saw this week they kind of implemented further some of the public programs around DDTs, including AI algorithms. And I do personally, in my role, see FDA interacting more with individual companies in kind of that middle category. And Diane, I'd welcome your thoughts there. I think the world has, their engagement level has really, and I know we probably have FDA people on the line here too that have comments on this, but the engagement really and is increased. But ultimately, that is the history of, and I thought it would be helpful to kind of frame that context, the history of why we don't have a third formal pathway, at least through the statute.
Right. Yeah, thank you, Diane. Thank you, Wade. Let's talk about some of the regulatory issues around digital twins. I'm going to ask Charles this question over here, but I also want to encourage the audience again, get all of your questions in. We've got a couple over there, but I'm going to take your questions at the end. I'm going to pose them to the panel, so get them in. But let's talk about regulatory issues around digital twins in early phase studies. So, what uses might be appropriate for these early phase studies, Charles?
Well, I think when we think about like early phase studies, we typically have, um, a couple of goals in these studies, right? So one would be just internal decision making, right? Should this program go forward? That's probably one of the most important goals that people are trying to figure out. But the other, of course, is to collect data that you can use to help, if you do decide to move forward, to help design that future pivotal clinical study. So I think then when we think about uses of digital twins for designing these trials, there are a lot of different ways that could work, right? So there are examples, and there's companies that we're talking with who, maybe are very early stage in their clinical programs, and they're running very small trials. Maybe they're small companies, they are resource constrained, and so you only have enough budget to run a 50-person clinical trial. And so you can add digital twins into that study to basically increase its statistical power, enable you to get better evidence for making that decision, but also for better, more accurate estimates of efficacy so that you can design better clinical trials. And then you can take that all the way up to maybe larger companies that have plenty of resources, but now they may have multiple drugs, or they may want to test the drug in many different patient populations. And now being able to run much sort of faster proof of concept studies where you are reducing the sample size potentially a lot, maybe even eliminating a control arm entirely. For early phase studies, those things are possible because you have less of a concern about false positives, and you really have a big concern about false negatives, right? The worst thing you could do is to have in an early phase proof of concept study is to reject your drug that turns out to be would have been very highly successful, right? So the early phase sort of landscape, I think, is very, very different from when you start thinking about later phase clinical trials, which I know we'll talk about here in a few minutes.
Well, let me ask you about that right now, actually. Let's talk about pivotal trials. So how does these regulatory concerns differ for a pivotal trial then?
Well, I think that they're completely different for for a pivotal trial. All of a sudden, you have a significant number of additional stakeholders who are brought in for one thing on a pivotal clinical trial, right? And now I think the goals, it's not actually, I would say that a pivotal clinical trial, one of the goals is clearly to support regulatory decision making. I mean, that's in some sense the main goal of it, right? And one of the key factors there is to ensure that you can control the likelihood of having a false positive result if you were testing something that in actuality doesn't work. So something that people call the type 1 error rate. So if you're testing water and just seeing if you can give people water and it's going to cure some disease, you don't want to constantly approve those types of things, right? So you don't want to be approving snake oil. You also have a lot more safety that comes into these later stage clinical trials. Early stage proof of concept studies are typically too small to get a lot of information about safety, and that becomes much more important as you move into pivotal or actually post-marketing studies, right? So the regulatory, I think, landscape becomes a lot more challenging, where we really need to ensure that we can create clinical trial designs that have the appropriate statistical properties, that have controlled type 1 error rates, that ensure we're not having bias from confounders or other kinds of things that are less important in early stage studies.
Okay. How about the guidance around this stuff around pivotal trials? Diane, how about the guidance from CDRH or CDER on this?
So I think the approval, if you look at the laws and the way they cascade down, I mean, the pivotal trials have the highest level of concern because they are the cornerstone of of a drug approval, and FDA totally owns that decision. So, getting FDA's input so you can put together a data package that can address all FDA's concerns with respect to whether your drug is safe and effective is very important. And guidances, even though they say it's their current thinking and it's not binding, it at least puts guideposts around what are things that should be on people's radar that they need to address. And in the case of machine learning and AI, I think as Wade said, devices have a framework, but the drug sides do not. And the one thing you really can't assume is what's good for devices is good for drugs. So that's why people always are crying out for guidances, because having too many options is not actually a good thing in drug development. You want to focus on what is important and help and provide the data to meet the evidentiary standards for approval, because that's the end goal.
Okay. All right. So, Charles, what is Unlearn doing today to be prepared for all of this regulatory scrutiny?
Well, I think one of the things that Diane just alluded to is, these are new methods, right? They're new methods, and that means that there is a degree of uncertainty, there's uncertainty probably from FDA side. They're encountering something that is new. And then there's uncertainty from the industry side, because people don't necessarily know, well, how is FDA going to react? We don't necessarily know, because there are not clear guidances necessarily on these things, what we are supposed to do as an industry, as a company. And so we've really been focused on trying to be prepared for really in-depth regulatory review or regulatory scrutiny. And that starts really at the planning phase, right? Ensuring that we have strong development processes in place, that, with engineering, ensuring that we are following. So we follow, FDA guidelines on software development and things that were actually put in place for medical devices, right? And this gets to that point of uncertainty. We're looking at the CDRH guidances for medical devices and saying, well, we'll follow those because that's what we have, right? And so we can go to building, creating standard operating procedures that will define how we're going to follow things, from, all the way from how are we going to clean our training data and create that data that we're going to use for training the AI models, all the way to, how are we going to ensure data security when we're actually using digital twins in the context of a clinical trial. So all of those different steps. And then the last thing is really about statistical analysis plans. How do you plan to use these digital twins in the actual protocol for a clinical trial, and creating those statistical analysis plans? And we spend a lot of time looking at FDA guidances. And again, we now have different guidances that are interesting. There's guidances like FDA's guidance on adjustment for covariates in clinical trials, which is from CDER, and then actually has informed a lot of the statistical analysis plans that we develop. But there's also like FDA's guidance on Bayesian statistics in clinical trials for medical devices. The title actually has 4 medical devices in it. And, we also are developing these Bayesian methods, and Bayesian methods are starting to be used in more drug trials. And so we have these questions, about how do we take these CDRH guidances and then apply them into these other areas. And I think that the most important thing for technology companies that are operating this space, or sponsors who are working with technology companies, I think, is really to, push the effort to think about, being preemptive and trying to make sure that you are thinking, well, what questions might the regulators ask for, and how can we be sure that we're prepared to answer those questions in an effective way?
All right, thank you. I've got a question here, and I'm going to pose this. I'd like to have everyone's answer on this one, actually. The question is, why do we need regulations for AI? And really, each of you could speak to it in very such specific sort of way, because Charles, you have an interest in that. Diane, you're a regulatory expert. Wade, you have that legislative and executive branch experience. So I'd actually like to start with your answer first, Wade. Why do we need regulations for this stuff?
Well, let me start by saying, you know, I'll mention three things. One is why do we need regulation, and I think to Charles' point, guidance from an FDA perspective. I'll start there, and then I'll move to Congress and then the industry. So with FDA, I think it's helpful to keep in mind the average FDA person comes to work every day driven by their commitment to protecting the public health. And I don't think we should just move past that when we're having this conversation, because they approach everything from a patient safety perspective, a consumer safety perspective. And so when they have things and tools that they have had decades, you know, of confidence around, you know, to get them to move to something else, you do have to do the kind of engagement that, Charles, I think you're talking about, you know, the kind of preemptive thinking, that being able to step up and answer their questions, and also recognize that they're learning too. And that having that kind of collaborative process where, you know, FDA is getting comfortable with this, taking one step at a time, it's going to be an iterative process. But I think that, you know, the guidance process internally at the agency, when I was there, I saw that process internally help get consensus within the agency, across the centers, across the review division. So I think one reason to have that we need regulation and guidance on this space is to give not only industry certainty, but also to get that consensus within the agency that process has. I think on the legislative side, you know, I'll just mention, and without going kind of on this tangent, that every 5 years, Congress reauthorizes FDA's medical product user fee programs, the PDUFA, MEDUFA, BsUFA, GDUFA programs. That is set for reauthorization in the summer of 2022, probably the spring of May because of the election. But you know, that is a legislative process where Congress does come in every 5 years and says, okay, where do we need to not only reauthorize the programs, but where do we need to tweak some of the authorities here and there? You can really imagine that, you know, FDA and, you know, other stakeholders are going to want to think about some of these innovative tools in that next reauthorization. And then finally, on the industry front, I think to Diane's point earlier around certainty, you know, that just speaks for itself. You know, being able, when you're doing investing in a sort of a drug development program, having the certainty, you know, does help. Although I think there's a lot of reasons to be optimistic to incorporate some of these innovative tools into programs, because you know, depending on the review division, I think there is openness to these kinds of solutions. So I know it's a long-winded answer, but I wanted to hit all three of those angles.
No, that was very good. Diane, how about anything to add to that? Diane, might have lost you. Well, while we wait for Diane to oh, you're back, Diane. All right. Okay, why we need regulations for AI?
So with all new technologies, you know, for me, I think investment is needed to make it grow into something that's robust and a reliable solution. And with having regulatory guidances or guideposts, it will help AI investment, because I think the regulatory uncertainty is a very big hurdle. And I'll give you an example of what I mean by that. When I was part of a big pharma company, we had this prioritization process for budget. And one of the inputs we had is something called PRS, probability of regulatory success. And probability of regulatory success is based on the law, the precedent, the guidances, and whatever drug-specific advice you had. And the more boxes you can tick in those, the higher the PRS is that you can justify. And the problem with the PRS and the IA solution, especially in the drugs, is it's always going to be below, very low, especially if you compare it to a traditional method. So I think that getting some regulatory frameworks or opinions or at least some current thinking would help close that gap and be helpful.
Okay. All right. Thank you. So, Charles, anything to add to that? Because we've heard some pretty eloquent takes on why we need regulations for certainty and whatnot. And here you are, the CEO and founder of an AI drug development company who's chomping at the bit for regulation. But what can you add to that? Can you add some color to that for us?
Well, before I was a CEO, I was a scientist, right? So most of my career was as a scientist. And I think, I still review papers. I review a couple papers a month, usually machine learning applications in biology in some sense. And most of those papers are terrible, right? So we're kind of in this environment right now where it's a wild west of people can grab off the shelf software, open source software, and apply it and get some output. And, that's not what's going to work in the end, I think, for producing good science and producing things that work in the end to make for patients. So, it's interesting, if you look at the way AI is covered in the media, in many cases, you have people talking about general intelligence and the singularity and it's going to take over. And as an actual AI researcher, it's much more the opposite. Most AI doesn't work very well. And the concern that I have is not that we're going to get super intelligent AI. It's that we're going to get terrible AI that doesn't work well, and that is then moved into the market, hurts people. And the amount of I talked a little bit about and the last thing about all the work that we're doing on sort of the engineering side. To put that in context, Unlearn is about 3.5 years old as a company. We've raised about $20 million in venture capital, and we are just now launching a product, right? 3.5 years and millions of dollars of investment focused on engineering and validation. And not everyone has the capability or the desire to put all that into it. So, what I'm concerned, again, is about ensuring quality of any AI-based drug development tools or any AI-based solutions. Same thing on the medical device side, right? AI-based solutions need to work well. And it's not just quality. It's a really good question here in the Q&A that I thought I would call out about sort of diversity and how we have some, is there a juxtaposition? Is there some tension between diversity in these AI-based approaches? And there absolutely can be, right? Not only, here the question about, patient selection. Are we going to use AI-based tools to select certain patients, right? But AI-based tools are trained on certain patient populations. And we actually want to make sure that their use does not exacerbate existing health disparities, right? Suppose you have a biomarker and that biomarker is trained entirely on the UK Biobank, and there's a whole lot of biomarkers that are being trained entirely on the UK Biobank. And that's a really specific patient population. It is patients living in the UK. Are those types of things going to generalize to other areas of the world, to other populations? That's a really important question. And so ensuring those types of things, that there's real validation, there's real standards applied to these AI-based tools, I think is really important from both a scientific question, but also for all the patients downstream who are going to depend on these for their medical care.
I mean, you've all gotten to that question. You also kind of got to this next question I wanted to answer before getting to the audience question too, which was really what challenges do the FDA face in setting forth these new regulatory frameworks? So I think you've touched at one. The audience member posed a good question over there. But wait, let me pose this question to you. What are these challenges? You mentioned that the legislative reauth is going to happen in 2022. So what are these challenges they're going to face then?
Yeah, I mean, two big picture challenges occur to me about FDA's ability to kind of set regulations around the space or guidance. And one is the balance FDA always has to strike, and I think we've all seen this in many guidance documents and even regulations, is they want to provide some clarity, but they also want to preserve flexibility for themselves. And that is kind of the ultimate tension within FDA's guidances, right? You saw this when they put out the framework that Diane mentioned a minute ago around real world evidence, right? there was a lot of information there, but at the end of the day, FDA was preserving a lot of flexibility to make case-by-case decisions, in a particular context of use. And I think that is one of the challenges they're going to have to navigate, because I agree with everything Charles said, that, to ensure that we don't have sort of, AI out there that sort of doesn't bring the quality that Charles mentioned. I think we need those kind of guidance and gold standard kind of applied to these new tools. But that's the balance. That balance, striking that balance, will be a challenge for FDA. That's something I think they can do. And the second one is, as I mentioned, and I think our friends on the line watching from CDER and CBER would acknowledge this, that the expertise that is needed to evaluate some of this is not, there are people at FDA that absolutely have that expertise, but it's not sort of the traditional expertise that everyone at FDA would sort of bring to those roles. One of the things in the Cures Act that was put in place was the ability to do more streamlined hiring and to pay higher salaries under the Cures Act salary bands. And FDA has started to implement those. So there are some tools that FDA has at its disposal to continue to bring in more and more expertise. But I think, that's another thing that the agency is going to have to continue to focus on, because, traditional drug application that doesn't deploy these kinds of solutions, wouldn't need the same kind of expertise that I think, these are going to require. So those are my two big picture challenges that are on my mind.
Okay. And now for everyone on the panel here too, what are your recommendations for what actions the FDA should take when assessing, improving, and creating standards for this stuff? So we've heard about the challenges, but what should FDA do? I mean, it also plays in line with this question, which all the audience members can actually read by going to the Q&A thing. But essentially, like Charles said, in the 21st Century CARES Act, the FDA encourages more inclusive clinical trials rather than an enriched, narrow set of patients. Is there a friction there? I think the panel agrees that there is a friction there, but what are their recommendations for what the FDA should do to address that and any other AI-based drug development tools? Maybe Diane or Charles, we could start with you.
From a selfish point of view, since I'm a regulatory strategist, I think that while we're still in this learning phase, if the technology companies could have more options in terms of getting some early input to what they're doing on at least a more predictable timeline, I think that would be very helpful. That would be my wish.
Okay. Charles, how about you?
Well, I have a long wish list.
All right. Well, I think FDA is on the line. So
yeah. Well, I have a long wish list, and some of these things are things that FDA could do today, and frankly, others of them would probably require legislation. So it's not necessarily things that FDA, I would say, is on the hook for today. These are more broader scale things. Like one of my big wishes would be that FDA gets the resources. Wade talked about earlier about how FDA, maybe they don't feel like they have the resources right now to take on some of these brand new initiatives. And I think to have Congress appropriate resources or provide pathways through PDUFA reauthorization that FDA could get access to resources through user fees or other ways, so that they could bring on additional people and dedicate time to some of these problems. That's definitely a big wish for me. I think that if I had to really boil it down to the two big things, though, that I think FDA could do now, the first one is really creating some more unification of the guidances and frameworks across the organization, right? What we've heard today is that, there's, centers of excellence in these other things in CDRH. There are guidances and frameworks out of CDRH on AI. And, could some of those programs be adapted to also, and leveraged in the, drug development space, right? Could we take those similar guidances or have a similar kind of pilot program, like the pre-certification pilot program that they tried in CDRH for devices and software as a medical device? Could similar tools, similar frameworks be used in the drug side? I think that unification would be very helpful for industry to reduce the regulatory uncertainty. And then the final thing I think is a focus on quality and validation of the sort of endpoint, whatever it is your goal is to actually achieve with these models, right? And there's different things that could be, right? That could be like focus on the accuracy of diagnosis, like we see in some software as a medical device, to for our case, focusing on ensuring that these models are making accurate predictions of prognosis for patients in control arms, and that those are being included in the right way in these clinical trials. So focusing on the statistical properties, the context of use of these cases, I think is really, really important when we're thinking about validation of these AI tools.
All right, well, that's a good wish list. Now, Wade, what's your wish list for the FDA here?
Well, one thing I'll just mention, because this is all public, FDA posts the meeting minutes from their PDUFA negotiations with the industry, and those have started to be posted over the last couple of months. So folks should take a look at those. They're available on the FDA website, and they do have in those these kinds of issues as part of that ongoing negotiation. Now we'll have to wait and see how it turns out, but that is good news heading towards some of the reauthorization mentioned, Charles, that you mentioned. I have to just double down on what Charles said about cross-center coordination. I have had this conversation a number of times with folks at FDA. Like, again, first of all, there are many people at FDA that are working hard on these issues. They're thinking about them deeply. They're ahead of them. In my experience, where there were programs that really got to drive forward at FDA, it's because when you talk to center leadership or commissioner office leadership or even department leadership, it was one of the top 3 or 5 things they mentioned as a priority, right? Those are the programs that get moved forward. They're the programs that get, I think back to it's a very different space, but, folks will recall the compounding pharmacy incident that happened in 2013, right? It was an area of FDA programs, but it wasn't a high priority. When that happened, there was this kind of a chief, Jane Axelrod, that was put in charge of the program across FDA, including ORA issues, and it drove forward, right? And, I do think there's going to be real value in the next administration also thinking about, does there need to be a agency-wide lead to really drive kind of these AI and digital health solutions forward in a coordinated way, kind of building on what the Center of Excellence at the Device Center has already started. I think there's a lot of room for that kind of priority. It's definitely difficult in the COVID era, right? Talk to anyone at FDA, and those demands on the centers have been really incredible. But this is where the world's going, and I think that kind of agency-wide leadership would be my top wish list, as you ask.
All right. Thanks for that. Okay, we've got just a couple minutes left here for our webinar. We got a few questions here from the audience. I'd like to pose those to our panel before we end our session here today. Charles, I got a couple quick ones for you. How do placebo digital twins generated using generative AI models compare to active arm patients modeled using PBPK models, which is prevalent in quantitative clinical pharmacology?
Well, I would say if we just do a comparison between, say, generative AI approaches and traditional dynamical systems models that are often used in other areas of pharma research, I actually think that this AI thing that we brought up with DeepMind earlier is a really good analogy there, right? The goal is the same. The problem is the same. You're making predictions about how some characteristic of a patient will change over time. The methods are different, and essentially that's probably all that I would want to say. You get deeper into the technical details, but the goals of sort of predicting patient prognosis, you could do that different ways. These AI approaches are really just modern, novel methods for doing that.
Okay. All right, let me just switch it and let's get to an FDA question. Maybe Wade, this could be for you, Diane or Wade. What would be the features of a suitable pilot project to drive cross-center collaboration on AI DDTs? Maybe Wade, you could get to that. The
Yeah,
features of a
I guess
suitable pilot project at
I mean, it's an
FDA.
interesting question. I also see the one before about GDPR. I kind of want to hit that one too if we have time
Okay.
to. But you know, 'cause that's a whole host of other issues that we'd unpack. But you know, as I mentioned, there are these programs already in place on the drugs and biologics side to qualify biomarkers, DDTs. We just saw on Monday FDA announced a pilot to qualify DDTs up to 2 to 4 a year, including AI-based algorithms. I mean, that's 3 days old, right? And you know, we see that movement going on. I think the question here is, are there areas to do suitable pilots across centers? You know, and there I would say, you know, that's absolutely possible. I think it goes back to my earlier comment that you do need someone to drive it. You know, and the question is that could be people within those centers deciding to kind of co-lead and drive. But to me, you know, that's something that that we would need to see kind of the FDA leadership sort of, you know, really embrace it. Again, if you look at the press release around the Digital Health Center of Excellence, you know, it's very carefully worded to say this is a CDR8 center that's a resource for the rest of the agency. And so that's the current state of play.
All right, then let's quickly get to that other question. So essentially, it's about a broader adoption of AI tools and the need to preserve patient data. So with new legislation like GDPR in Europe, how are firms handling these emerging issues, Wade?
Yeah, I'll just say that this is a great question because the overlay of the Health Regulatory Authorities regulation, which is FDA or EMA, and then the data privacy frameworks, including HIPAA in the US, GDPR, and thinking ahead to inspectional requirements, data retention requirements, and then sort of cross-border data transfer. You know, you'll see why I immediately said it's something to unpack. That's going to take a while. It is definitely something people are thinking about deeply. There are ways to navigate it, but you know, those frameworks were not written in a way to all be coordinated. And it's an area where I think FDA could put out guidance and be helpful in some ways. You know, for example, the HIPAA exception in the U.S. is when data is required to be kept by law. You know, there's some things where FDA could help there in some of its guidance development. So it's a great question and much more to cover than in the last few minutes of our panel.
Okay, anything to add, Charles?
Yeah, Arsalan, I think it's this. I agree with Wade. This is a very interesting question. Not only in the short term, as people are trying to figure out how these different regulations will intersect with each other, but I think in the long term, this is a really interesting question. Not only about patient privacy and protecting that, but about data ownership. I think there's a really interesting thing in the long term about who's going to end up owning patient data. I mean, right now, you know, patient data is often sort of proprietary thing of the company, right? You see this where with EMR companies basically selling people's anonymized patient data. Sometimes they don't even know that that's going on. Usually they don't know that's going on, right? And I think that there is you know, and if I had to describe another thing on my long-term wish list, it would be some sort of solution that puts data ownership in the hands of the patient, right? That where a patient can actually not only in terms of ensure privacy of their data, but they can actually own their data in some significant way. And you know how that will interact with AI-based tools that are used not only in drug development, but also for software for medical devices, as clinical decision support, and how those tools are all going to interact with this ecosystem where patients own their data, I think is a really, really interesting direction, not only of regulatory, but technological development over the next, you know, 2 decades, probably.
All right.
It won't be
Okay.
fast.
All right. Well, I think it's a good note to end because I think it's all the time that we're going to have for our webinar. Charles, I want to thank you and Unlearn AI for sponsoring this webinar series. I really learned a ton. I know the Endpoints audience did, so I want to thank you for that. Diane Shoda, CEO of Grayscale, and Wade Ackerman, partner at Covington. Thank you for sharing your time and expertise with the Endpoints audience today. I really appreciate it, and thank you on behalf of the audience. For Endpoints News, I am Arslan Arif, and we will see you at the next webinar. Thank you, and see you again.